Okay, great. So, for those of you who may have read my abstract, I initially had a very particular set of things that I wanted to say today, but found that the rationale for presenting them was quite large and was more than a 20-minute paper in itself. So I thought that I would take this opportunity, as is befitting this kind of class, to really just list quite a selective series of issues that have been raised in response to both being an event and logics of words, and then kind of ask questions to you in terms of why isn't this particular way of approaching things possible, or why isn't this particular way of approaching things possible. And I thought that would be a good way of going about things, particularly as this is the first participants paper that we're presenting. So let me begin by asking aloud what we perceive the value of produced work to be. There are many possibilities. For some of us, the benefit of produced ontology could be for its ability to explain how scientific, political, amorous or artistic situations have developed as they have. We could even say that they could be of use in our current struggle for in the face of neoliberalism. Others may not be so politically minded, of course. The importance of produced ontology could be found in its reinstantiations of notions of subjectivity into the continental tradition. And I'm talking, of course, in the way that we view things in the Anglophone world here. And as Oliver has pointed out, the distinction is not so apparent in the French tradition. To others, Jew's influence may be important in the growing tensions between the distinction between analytic and continental traditions. So it's exactly the point I was just kind of making. I believe, though, that there is a single characteristic which underlies all these reasons for valuing produced ontology, and it's a reason which has been drawn out in Oliver's paper just now, which is that the prospect of explaining structural change without undue without placing undue emphasis on the subject-structure dichotomy, which has played a prominent part in the development of to put it another way, the core value of set theoretical ontology and the Bajuni event is that it implies a flexible structural model which far outperforms previous ontological models in its ability to account for novelty and the role of subjectivity. So it must be noted that this is not the only value and justification for Bajuni's ontological position. We are no doubt aware of the importance of the mathematical rationales for both being an event and logics of words, as it is frequently been Bajuni's sincere regard for mathematics, which has set him apart from competing philosophical positions, right back to the Althusserian texts. With this in mind, it is of the utmost importance that any commentary on Bajuni's ontology must be consistent with the mathematical principles which underlie it. In this paper, however, I want to take the comprehension of change to be the principal aim of the Bajunian project, as indicated by Bajuni himself in foreword of Logics of Worlds. In this vein, I will speak incontrovertibly in support of the broad approach that Bajuni adopts, whilst at the same time highlighting how the precise formulation of being an event and logics of worlds may present a challenge for those of us committed to constructing a more viable model of structural change. So I will also attempt to indicate that I believe the focus of our collective endeavour should be I will also attempt to indicate what I believe the focus of our collective endeavour should be in the face of logics of worlds. as we are all up to speed with the overall structure of being an event, thanks to Oliver's paper, I won't waste time giving a recap, particularly as time is quite precious in a 20-minute paper. I will, on the other hand, offer an indication of what I see as being the key criticisms which have been directed at being an event, and in particular those to which logic supports response. So the first criticism to mention is that which is typically understood to have been motivated Bourdieu's move towards including category theory in his ontology. I'm referring to Jean Toussaint Desanti's objection that the ontology of being an event is, quote, too impoverished to accomplish what Bourdieu expects of it because of its exclusive basis in set theory. Now, Desanti, of course, wondered whether ontology had to deploy itself within a set theoretical universe, or whether contemporary mathematics, in particular category theory, could offer possibilities which would allow for another basic ontology. So these are things that we've already come to today. So the mathematics of the transcendental and logics of worlds were, of course, direct responses to concerns such as these. However, I want to question whether appending category theory to the ontology of being an event is indeed a necessary response. What, we might ask, is the underlying principle behind Desanti's objection? Is it simply that Bourdieu is not inclusive enough of all readings of mathematics? Is it that any mathematical ontology will always arbitrarily select which mathematics it takes to be its foundation? Or is it that the particular formation of being an event is problematic because its framework is too minimal? For my part, I believe the former to be the stronger objection. And we may find support in Peter Hallward, who believes that being an event, and it's a quote, liberal foundation on the void appears to eliminate any significant link between the ontological and the ontic domains, between being qua being and being qua beings. In other words, while set theory may deliver the benefits of prescription over description, the insubstantial and circular definitions of fundamental concepts such as a set bring into question the possibility that any set theoretical concepts can have a substantive, unambiguous and consistent definitions. Consequently, while set theoretical ontology broached new avenues for philosophy, and these again are Hallward's words, it did so at the cost of rendering the discourse of being utterly abstract. So, as such, the inviolability of Bourdieu's conceptual framework and terminology is brought into question, such that set theoretical ontology could not reliably be deployed in the analysis or exposition of human reality in the here and now. If this is so, it becomes quite precarious to speak of being an event in terms of providing an account of the material actualization or emergent self-realization of the people, the kind of beings that we really typically associate with ontology. The second criticism, which follows on from Desanti and Hallward's, is that being an event's minimal framework does not provide an adequate account of structural change. And as I hope I have indicated, we are talking about issues here which have since been addressed by subsequent texts. I'm touching here upon the well-known criticism which has been made by several commentators that the event privileges an abrupt, if not miraculous or quasi-miraculous approach to the mechanics of historical change, whereby an event comes and goes in a flash, devoid of duration other than a retrospective temporality. And those are, that's again a quote. what commentators like, what these commentators have been implying is that even if a miraculous description of the event is all we are ever going to have because of the limitations of formalism and such like, events could not happen without some kind of facilitatory material embodiment. Without a theory of embodiment, which could provide a plausible account of the disseminatory process of the event, and this is what I think is important, the disseminatory process of the event. I think that, as opposed to necessarily how the event is born out in the situation, I think there's a difference there, which hopefully we'll have time to go into. The decision of an event would be drawn from a singular and centralised agency, something like a subject of the structure, and it would be, by necessity, to be disseminated through the situation in an immediate and ubiquitous process. As such, there would be no propensity for subjects of different truths to be born in the situation. Being would be, as Sam Gillespie calls it, univocal. As is readily apparent, univocity is not desirable because, as Hallward points out, the best examples of events are those affirmations whose truth exceeds the resources of proof or justification, are precisely ones that begin with an initially obscure but irreversible break with the established routine of the governing situation, in which the decisions required to sustain, for instance, political or artistic revolution, or unexpected declarations, will not easily convince sceptical onlookers of their validity, unless they are to develop a means of conviction capable of changing the prevailing logic of the situation. So it is these Mosaic-like examples which more accurately reflect how novelty and change occurs. It is in Bourdieu's more Mosaic examples where the value of this reassertion of subjectivity and truth can be grasped. Yet, whilst many of Bourdieu's examples stretch over extended periods of time, they rarely, if at all, give accounts of the roles and actions of individuals which drive the event forward. Now, it is quite understandable why this is the case. Being an event does not provide us a framework for expressing the manifold possibilities for individual experience within a collective situation. As such, these examples can only be discussed through recourse to a crude, under-theorised and unformalised notion of experience. It's something that we have to add, and it's something which different readers may bring different understandings to. That might be a good thing, but that is the case as it is. So let's take an example through which we can explore this further. We could say that the Cantor happened in 1874 with the publication of On a Characteristic Property of All Real Algebraic Numbers, or could we? The content of this article was formulated and written in 1873 and initially rejected for publication. Even before this, the foundations of set theory were laid through the work of various other mathematicians. We could say that together these mathematicians manifested the action of the structure, but would this not reduce the importance of their work? Did their work achieve nothing beyond laying the foundations for the linear progression of ZFC, Kurt Gödel and Paul Cohen? The fact that we are calling it a Cantor event, the fact that it seems natural to call it a Cantor event, rather than the Cohen event, whilst at the same time acknowledging the supreme importance of Cohen's discovery, the theory of forces being as important as it is in being an event. What this indicates is a tendency to reduce the evental process to a single occurrence rather than describe it in its fits and starts in which scientific developments are typically made. Indeed, it would be churlish to insist that the development of set theory subsequent to Cantor has been devoid of novelty and revolutionary development. Even if we accept that 1874 saw the event where it became impossible to address the fundamental basis of mathematics without discussing sets, whether it be corroboratively or contradictorily, what would have happened if Cantor had been slower to reveal himself? So let's imagine Cantor held off announcing his conclusions by a decade or so, as was the case with Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. What would the truth status have been for set theory in that intervening decade? In between 1874 and 1884, Cantor would have known of the truth of set theory and would have been able to see problems in preceding theories which others did not. Yet the state of the situation and the collective structure of mathematicians and mathematical discourse would have been oblivious to such developments, at least in a large part. In this circumstance, we may say that the state of the situation was extended in such a way that the vast majority of it remained unexposed to the new development. Novel multiples were drawn from the void and positioned in such a way that their impact upon being was not univocal, but restricted to the experience of Cantor himself, as well as, in a different sense, to those who had played a part in his unsuccessful attempt at publication. There may have been implicit and unconscious effects which alluded to such developments. For instance, Cantor could have adopted a haughty disposition to public discussions of mathematics. Yet the truth status of set theory would have been undecidable by virtue of the set theoretical principles remaining non-constructible for the majority of the state of the situation. In short, to repeat Gillespie, it must be the case that at the moment of their appearance, events are recognised only by certain subjects, while others regard them as non-existent or as aberrations. Yeah. 5 minutes. Okay. In essence, the Cantor event appears not to be one singular event itself, but a series of lesser events which are grouped together under the name of Cantor, but in reality are composed of many elements which diverge dramatically from the principles which Cantor himself would have recognised. As such, it is slightly misleading to say that subsequent and contemporary exponents of the development of set theory are faithful to the original truth of the Cantor event. It's something different now to what it was then. Broadly, the core principles are the same. But I think the differences are substantial. So I'm talking the difference between naive set theory and ZMC. So in essence, sorry, I've lost my place. So even designating when the event occurred would entail the choosing of a particular moment, which is designed as the pivotal moment according to an arbitrary set of criteria. It would have to select when the event occurred for some individuals at the expense of the potentially numerous individuals for which it occurred at a different point. At best, we are appealing to a crude notion of experience. At worst, we are ignoring individual experience altogether. Could not an event be an emergent process which takes whatever time it takes, and which requires a theory of emergence as well as of change and process? At this point, we can ask where the problem is. After all, wouldn't we expect philosophy based in set theoretical mathematics to eschew notions of subjectivity which arise from the clearly definable limits of the human body? perhaps. But we know from the way that Bourdieu and others discuss the significance of his work, the desire to reconstruct notions of meaningful subjectivity and truth are sincerely held. If we take Bourdieu's discussion of 1968, for example, Bourdieu asks, for what was taking place? Yes, we were genuine actors, but actors absolutely seized by what was happening to them. As by something extraordinary, something properly incalculable. Whilst this quote may not appear too shocking, it does bring our attention to the possibility that objective events can be seen and understood from a first-hand experiential perspective, of which there are many. I hope you can see that these quotes, quotes such as this, imply more substantial roles of individuals, though through appealing to categories of affect that presuppose a subjective experience that is gripped or seized by something incalculable. So without the capability to describe calculated individuals and the functions they act out in the process of the event, we run the risk of endorsing univocal being with recourse only to a mysterious and esoteric disseminative process of following an event. At the end of being an event, we are faced with a dilemma. If we do not want set theoretical ontology to be able to account for the evental process in its full complexity, we must resolve the shortfalls evident in a minimalist theoretical framework. Being an event requires a supplementary and phenomenology-like, and I'm quoting, I'm alluding to Gillespie again here, framework which can account for the roles of individuals in the dynamic structural process, and in particular the means through which different eclectic perspectives can give rise to stunningly varied possibilities, responses to the event. Does it not also need logics of worlds to explain the emergence of the event? As we know, logics of worlds is an attempt to provide such a framework in the form of category theory. Due to limitations of time, I must presume that you have a broad understanding at this stage, and move on to a critical discussion of
that's 10 minutes.
Okay.
Do you want to bring up these other points of discussion with us? Or do you want to do a summary?
Right, so so basically, what I wanted to bring out, which I haven't quite got to, is a discussion in terms of how Logics of Worlds tries to resolve these problems. And I had two things that I wanted to bring to our attention here. The first is the use of the term body. And I wanted to suggest, and I wanted to demonstrate that there is an ambiguity in the use of the word body, which could potentially reveal somewhere where we could more concretely locate individual action or the roles of individuals if we were to try and resolve this. And I also wanted to bring another point, which was to mention Paulwood's discussion of the transcendental register, or the transcendental as it plays in Logics of Worlds, in the sense that he suggests that in having the transcendental register indexing all multiplicity, it implies a meta-transcendental register to the extent which is able to essentially provides the information to the transcendental register of what it needs to provide. And I was hoping to try and indicate to you how this might be potentially perceived as repeating the kind of univocal or the univocity of being which Sam Gillespie noted. And like I say, I've got to skip over that, unfortunately. But ultimately, I wanted to suggest that there is the possibility of that militant subjectivity which we associate with the Jews' ontology, and that we might be able to we might be able to fix it in a stronger way. We might be able to pin it down more if we try and talk about situations in terms of scale and in terms of interacting with each other. So one of the problems that one thing that seems to be missing for meaning logics of worlds is the discussion of just how worlds can interact with each other. And I think that I'm guessing I'll have to explain to several of you this in conversations. Yeah. But yeah, essentially, I'm trying to suggest that it might be made possible to think of situations in terms of scale and in terms of interacting with each other, to the extent that we could potentially, in the kind of same move that Oliver Felton talks about models, in terms of deducing a kind of general model from many examples of models. So yeah, I'll cut it short there. Apologies. Obviously, my reading speed is slower than I estimated. But
we have some flexibility. We can cut into the lunch hour, which we already have. But
yeah,
you might
I've already sort of given an overview of the last couple of pages. So there's no point in going back on it. But we can take questions really quickly.
Would you like questions now, or Brian? Perhaps I can take your advice. Would it be a constructive contrast to take your contribution and then have questions together? What would you like?
I think we discussed this in the
so said we'll take separate questions.
Separate questions. Okay, questions for Oliver then, please.
Yeah.
I was struck by the use of the term explanation when you were citing like Peter's problems and problems with set theory ontology. Those questions seem to presuppose that the job of ontology is to explain human reality.
Yeah.
And nothing could be further from the case.
Okay.
As on my reading of set theory ontology, because it just simply that as soon as you say ontology explains reality, you've got a causal model of reality where cause is just one concept with which we can grasp reality. And your question about the interaction of worlds is also about cause as well. And I think that the commitment to ontology being an explanatory discourse and explaining causes is part and parcel of the empiricist problem in our understanding of
Okay, so the reason why I'm sort of going down that route is that I don't think it's at core from empirical. The reason why I'm doing it isn't for empiricist reasons. I think that if we want to be able to use an ontology such as the Jews to speak in terms of political situations, and in terms of how we can potentially use this awareness in terms of strategizing for how we go forward in terms of political situations, I think this is it's necessary. I'm not necessarily implying that the job of ontology is to do as you said. It's more that for pragmatic reasons, I think it's necessary to identify what's being discussed with particular situations in that we can identify with objectives that we're involved in. Is that satisfactory?
It's funny that you were talking about sequences of history and how events don't happen miraculously necessarily, they kind of build over a period of time. Because I feel similarly about the Schoenberg event or the emancipation of dissonance in music, because it's often portrayed as being a rapid disjuncture between everything that preceded it, whereas in actual fact it's something that grew very much organically from kind of Wagner through to obviously Schoenberg. And I think the difference in kind of defining it as either an event or as a continuation is the way that Schoenberg himself defined his innovation. So people tend to define it as atonality, which atonality implies that it's not tonal anymore. It kind of levels the playing field sort of thing and creates a new concept of what music is. And he didn't like that because he made whether it was ideological or not, he made a concerted effort to portray his music as being a linear continuation of history from Brahms, developing variation and other things. And he defined his music as a pantonality, which is all tonality at once. So it's a kind of it's the idea of where changing images from, does it emerge from the kind of peripheries of a situation that's explainable, or does it emerge from a kind of continual presence in history of a certain idea, I guess. So that kind of have sympathy, have feel with that.
So, okay, I'll leave it there. So, will we shuffle in?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm struggling.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Press down the words.
Yeah, it should take you 20 minutes to get through this.
Okay.
Hopefully. Okay, so my paper is entitled, not too instructively, The Axiom of Choice and the Transcendental. It'll be more about the axiom of choice than the transcendental, I guess. So I'll just sort of dive into it and hopefully be able to get through it all. So given the short length of the presentation and the nature of the workshop as a whole, I think I want to be sort of more productive and lay my cards on the table and just start with a few polarizing comments about how I read Badiou, and that will sort of set the stage for some questions. So despite the obvious influence of Marxist, psychoanalytic, structuralist and post-structuralist thought on Badiou, as sort of Oliver's made clear, I take a great interest in the existential sort of influence, or existentialist influence of Sartre. And I think this leads to one of the most popular aspects of Badiou's philosophy, sort of first noted by Peter Holwood, which is there is in Badiou's work a return to a certain form of voluntarism. I know that carries a lot of baggage with it, but it's more what Peter Holwood calls a philosophy of the decision. And that's the ability for an individual to make a difference through a decision and a commitment to a cause or an idea. The whole sort of idea that as an individual you can be transformed into a subject via a certain form of commitment, or something like that. And I think that's one of the genuinely appealing sort of aspects of Badiou's philosophy. I've seen it over the last 10 or 15 years in the sort of Anglophone tradition take hold on that sort of level. And I think that this is not a return to a vulgar existential subject able to produce radical change from nothing. Our freedom is necessary. Our freedom is a necessary, our individual freedom is a necessary aspect of radical change, but it is not sufficient. And obviously we need the supplement of the event, and you get that sort of dual characteristic throughout Badiou's work. So it is this sense of agency or potential that Badiou gives to the individual, which I think carries something of the existentialist legacy. This potential in connection to an event provides a model of authenticity. Okay, so I'm going to throw that out there. We can call it fidelity. I kind of like to read fidelity as a sort of form of authenticity, but not tied to a phenomenological subject in that sense. So this potential in connection to an event provides a model of authenticity in the form of being subject to an event. Okay, and that's obviously in terms of the later philosophy, a faithful subject as opposed to a reactive subject or an obscure subject. So I believe that this aspect of individual existential freedom is formally expressed in Badiou's philosophy through his use of the axiom of choice. And I want to defend this reading and highlight some of the critical potential in three short sections. So first of all, a brief definition of the axiom of choice and what it entails, along with a summary of its role in being an event. 2, an outline of the structure of the forcing proof for the independence of the axiom of choice, to show how there is a blind spot in Badiou's use of Cohen's method in being an event, i.e. the method of forcing that Badiou focuses on most in being an event is the proof for the independence of the continuum hypothesis. And forcing is used in a very different way for the forcing of the proof of the independence of the axiom of choice. So I want to focus on that and some of the consequences of it.
and 3 if I get a chance. A look at the implicit or unmentioned importance of the axiom of choice in logics of worlds, and its fundamental role in the relationship between the phenomenological or transcendental and the underlying ontology in sort of set 3. So that whole relation between the two, the whole notion of, or the idea of points, which is so important for logics of worlds. How do we get this connection between the transcendental world and the ontological sort of base, if you like? How do you make that connection? In the sort of mathematical apparatus, it's always done using something called the prime ideal theorem, which is one of, quite often, an equivalent of the axiom of choice. So although the axiom of choice is not discussed in logics of worlds so much, it is implicitly there, especially in this relationship between the worlds of appearance and the sort of set theoretical ontology. Okay. So first of all, what is the axiom of choice? There are many definitions of the axiom of choice, and there are even more equivalent statements which are equivalent to it. So I'll stick to, if you like, the most basic and the most well-known. And that says, to give a definition, given a collection of sets, most normally a set of sets, there is a function called a choice function that can create a new set formed by choosing just one element from each of the non-empty sets in the original collection. Okay, so it sounds relatively complicated, and mathematics nearly always sounds complicated, and when you understand it, it says something incredibly simple. So it just says, you have a lot of sets, all of those sets have elements. You can make a new set just by going to each one of those sets, picking one of its elements, each going from set to set to set, and you make a new set from that sort of activity of choice. It seems relatively simple, relatively uncontroversial. So why is it so important? What is interesting about this axiom, for me anyway, in some sense, is its use of the term choosing. We can choose. Which implies, in a really naive fashion, if you like, all of the freedom of a random or contingent choice, or even the kind of freedom associated with radical free will and all those sorts of ideas. And one of the reasons why, on a sort of like taste, a level of taste or aesthetic taste, why a lot of mathematicians don't like the axiom of choice is precisely because it seems to imply something like a notion of radical free will or arbitrary, whimsical choice. So that's one of the reasons why there's a, let's say, some distaste for it. So what's important about it is the fact that no rule is given for how this choice is carried out. We can choose. What does that mean? And the whole point is, you don't have to say how that choice is made. You just assert that the choice is possible. Okay. So no rule is given for how this choice is carried out. The axiom asserts the existence of such a new set without showing it. Okay. Without giving any rule for its construction. This is especially significant when we're dealing with infinite collections, and that's obviously where things become the most sort of interesting. We usually cope, if you think about this and you've looked at set theory at all, you usually cope with infinite sets by using finite sets of conditions in order to sort of define them or manipulate them in some sort of way. So the set of natural numbers is defined by the process of succession. That's very easy to define in finite terms what that process is. We think of odd numbers and even numbers, they're both infinite collections, but they have a very simple finite sort of statement of conditions or properties that they satisfy. So we normally deal with infinite sets by talking about finite sets of conditions which somehow describe them. What's problematic about the notion of the axiom of choice is when you start to talk about infinite sets. What does it mean to say that a set exists where I choose one element from an infinite set of those sets? How can I assert the existence of that set? What does it mean? Okay, so that's some of the stuff that begins to get your mind thinking that this simple notion of choice is actually something more complicated. Yes. Okay. So, and of course, any finite collection can at least be retrospectively given a finite description simply by listing the choices that you've made as the conditions. And that's one of the sort of key points I think about the axiom of choice. Is there's often this notion of people will say sort of things like, you think you're making a series of free choices, but retrospectively I can reduce what you think is a radical expression of your freedom, or being a subject to event or something like that. Retrospectively, I can just reduce that into a kind of finite set of conditions, even if it's the really laborious one of just listing all of the finite choices that you made. Not particularly elegant, but it is nonetheless a finite description. So, for infinite collections of sets, the axiom of choice commits us to a belief in completely random, arbitrary or free choices, take your pick, that cannot be compressed or reduced into a pattern or a rule. As such, the axiom also does not simply state the existence of one choice function, this is crucial, or free choice, but it asserts the existence of a multiplicity of such functions or choices. given that infinite choice, you might make one set of choices. Given that set of choices again, you might make a different choice. They're both selections of choice. So when you say that a choice function exists, you're not actually saying one choice exists. You're saying multiple choices exist. Okay. So Badiou states in Being an Event, what is at stake here is a presentability without presentation. That's what's so sort of important here. There is a set which represents the choice function, if you like, but I can't tell you what's actually in it. I can't give you the rule for its construction. So there's presentability without presentation of what's actually sort of involved. And it allows us to assert the existence of things that fall outside of the usual frame of ordered, regular, legal being. And so these, in a sense, give rise to our ability to talk about illegal beings, i.e. non-constructible sets. So illegal, in a sense, obviously means without a rule, okay? Lawless or without a rule. It doesn't mean inconsistent in terms of a kind of contradiction. That's something completely different. So this notion of illegality doesn't mean contradiction. It means it's non-constructible in some sort of sense, or it's not reducible to a pattern or a rule or anything like that. So the only way that we can assert it exists is by asserting something like a free choice. Okay. Yes, so it's something that would obviously allow us to disrupt the status quo. More fully, Badiou thinks that the axiom of choice captures our capacity for intervention, and this is, I think, Meditation 22 in Being an Event. To give a sort of slightly longer quote, he states, the hypothesis I advance is the following. Within ontology, the axiom of choice formalizes the predicates of intervention. It is a question of thinking intervention in its being, without the event. We know ontology has nothing to do with the latter. The undecidability of the event's belonging is a vanishing point that leaves a trace in the ontological idea in which the intervention being is inscribed, a trace which is precisely the unassignable or quasi-non-one character of the function of choice, to end the quote. So here we note that this capacity for intervention is independent from the event. Neither the event nor the interventional freedom is sufficient on its own to create radical change, and Badiou is quick to point out that one of the most well-known equivalents of the axiom of choice is the claim that all sets can be well-ordered. And this is an example, if you like, of the autocratic power of our freedom if it's exercised in the absence of any exceptional happening or event. And I think this is, if you want to see something, the biggest contrast with traditional existentialist philosophy, freedom of choice has no inherent value in itself. Okay? It cannot generate radical change simply by fiat of its own power. Okay? It is dependent on material conditions upon which it can intervene. That's sort of interesting. Badiou's account of subjectivity and forcing draws on this need of an event and a capacity for intervention, something that can affirm the trace of an event and put it into action. Forcing takes advantage of the axiom of choice in its choice of the generic extension added to the ground model of set theory. So to take the classic example, the set added to the ground model used to prove the independence of the continuum hypothesis has greater than Aleph1, normally Aleph2, or it can be any sort of number like that at all, element, and each element is a non-constructible set. So the way that the generic sort of forcing procedure works, first of all, is you say there are a number of subsets which haven't been taken into account by constructible methods, and we're going to explicitly add them in these non-constructible sets, which I can assert exist because of things like the axiom of choice. The axiom of choice allows us to assert the existence of them, but more importantly, it allows us to put them into play or into action. Because we can all assert the existence of things like ghosts, for example, which have no ability to interact with the real world, so it's kind of pointless talking about them. But these non-constructible sets might have that quality if it wasn't for something like the axiom of choice, which allows us to put those sort of things into play. So the proof of the continuum hypothesis is quite simple. The continuum hypothesis says the power set of the natural numbers is Aleph1, the next biggest cardinal number. And the proof of its independence is relatively simple. It just says, well, if we actually add in Aleph2 sets into the ground model and extend it and show it's consistent, etc., then that set obviously has more subsets than Aleph1. Job done. That's the sort of simplicity of it. It's quite a simple concept, but obviously to do it is beyond most of our mathematical ability, certainly to invent it. Okay, so the axiom of choice is necessary to assert the existence of non-constructible sets of omega, And the process of forcing respects their non-constructible nature by showing how they differ from every constructible set and from each other. And that's the sort of value of this sort of forcing procedure. You put those sets into the ground model, and then you show how those generic sets are non-constructible, i.e. they're different from every constructible set. They don't satisfy any of the constructible criteria. They will always differ from those constructible sets according to some finite amount of information. And even more importantly, for what I want to talk about next, they differentiate themselves from each other. Those separate choice functions, or those separate sort of like generic sets, are differentiated not only from everything constructible, but they're also differentiated from each other. So there's no sort of claim that can be made of, oh, all of those generic sets are the same. They're non-constructible, how can you differentiate them? You can, using the process of forcing, differentiate between those generic sets, or those elements of the generic set. So Badiou follows closely the model of Cohen's proof for the independence of the continuum hypothesis. And this is the more sort of philosophical aspect, I guess. A generic set of non-constructible elements is added to the original model to create the extended model, which is called the generic extension. The process of forcing is the incorporation of these new sets into the ground model and represents the transformation of a mortal individual into an immortal subject. The formal definition of a subject as a finite portion of an infinite truth procedure allows for the possibility of group subject, which I think personally, from my own research, has been one of the other very important breaks, especially with someone like Sartre, for whom you can only have a group of subjects. Badiou's philosophy allows you to have a group subject. So there isn't a simple sort of notion of an individual is transformed into a subject. No, an individual can be incorporated into a group subject, as most political sort of movements are. For Badiou, this extension is an occasion of radical change, as a certain theorem or axiom that was consistent in the original model becomes inconsistent in the extended model. And that's the most crucial sort of point. This is how the continuum hypothesis, the independence of the continuum hypothesis works. You have the continuum hypothesis, and it is consistent with the ground model. You create the generic extension, and that hypothesis, or axiom if you like, fails. It becomes inconsistent in the generic extension. And it's very important, that's where it happens. It happens in the generic extension. To quote Badiou, he says, "Thought in its novelty, the situation to come presents everything that the current situation presents, but in addition it presents a truth. By consequence, it presents innumerable new multiples. This theme of the world to come, as an infinite task that the subject is engaged in bringing about, provides us access to this truth, as we can act as if the process has been completed while remaining committed to the infinite project itself." So this is the sort of mathematical or lived kind of aspect of being a subject. The mathematician states that the proof is done and finished. States that the proof is done and finished, whereas in terms of the militant is actually involved in, if you like, that kind of philosophical proof itself. So they have this dual character. They are, as an individual, taken up into the infinite task of producing this, but they can also look ahead and act as if the process has been completed and the truth has been achieved in some sense. So we don't have to create the world to come in order to have any sort of say or discussion about the truths which are made possible by this. But it is this structure where the truth or model, where inconsistency is forced, is the generic extension, is one that I want to question. And that's, for me, probably the most important thing that I want to talk about. So, section 2, what I call existential risk or authenticity in bad faith. The axiomal theorems that methods of forcing seek to find independence proofs for do not always find their fulfillment in the generic extension of the ground model. The independence proof for the axiom of choice is one such example. In his classic textbook on set theory, Thomas Yek describes it in the following manner. If the ground model satisfies the axiom of choice, then so does the generic extension. However, we can still use the method of forcing to construct a model in which the axiom of choice fails. Namely, we find what's called a suitable submodel of the generic model, which he calls M, such that you have the ground model, you have the generic extension, and then you have this model that sits in between, which is a submodel of the generic extension, and the original ground model is a submodel of that model. So in a sense, you have to create the generic extension in order to produce something which is between the two, which is sort of between them. So the axiom of choice is made to fail in what is called the symmetric submodel, which is formed between the ground model and the generic extension. choice can only fail by failing to sustain a difference between the choices that it makes. And this is what the symmetric submodel does. And unfortunately, I can't go into details. The earliest proofs for the independence model, as Badiou sort of pointed out earlier, relied on what's called theories of set theory with atoms. They're called permutation models, whereby you add atoms in. Okay, so ZFC with atoms, models of set theory. That is, theories that included an axiom for the inclusion of atoms. These fundamental objects are indistinguishable from the empty set and from each other using the traditional extensional sort of machinery of set theory. You have to add all sorts of extra stuff in to sort of make the atoms work in that way. But what they are, as you can already see, is that they are things which make making differences and distinctions difficult, because there's no way within set theory, traditional sort of extensional set theory, to differentiate between the empty set and all of these atoms, or between the atoms themselves. Their differences can't be defined in terms of their internal structure, because they have no internal structure. They're proper atoms. There is no internal structure. So, yes, in his original proof of the independence of the axiom of choice, Paul Cohen makes it clear that one of the advances of his method is you do away with atoms. You don't have to do it, as you sort of pointed out. It's not a very clean or elegant system of set theory to have atoms in. If you look at the history of set theory, they were only added in order to prove the independence of the axiom of choice, which seems incredibly instrumental and not particularly elegant. And not too much work is done on them these days. So in his original proof, Paul Cohen states this, and Yek says something similar in his textbook. In our model, generic sets will play a role similar to these atoms. Okay? So the role of generic sets is going to be to become like atoms in this forcing proof. This is a very specific role that differs from the role in the proof of the independence of the continuum hypothesis, where they simply have to provide a consistent extension to the ground model. So I do not think, and I'm happy to be corrected, I do not think that Badiou fully explores this different use of forcing, or the type of subject that may be involved in its production. An individual caught up in the militant activity of a subjective process that has as their aim or project the incorporation of the trace of the event and the production of an extended situation in terms of the generic extension. So, but what if this world to come, and this subject would be doing the same thing, they're building this generic extension in the same way. What if this world to come, this infinite project of the now immortal subject, simply preserves the status quo? I think I'm in this radical sort of subjective moment where I'm incorporated in proving the independence of the axiom of choice. I'm creating, or whatever, it doesn't necessarily have to be the axiom of choice. There is this generic model that I'm creating, the world to come, and I believe in that this world to come, something will change, i.e. there will be something that's consistent in the ground model that becomes inconsistent in the extension. But I'm wrong, because nothing changes. The infinite product of the now immortal subject simply preserves the status quo. The generic extension of the world to come produces no radical change, no disruption of the situation. Okay. The radical change can only occur in the symmetric submodel, and the nature of this radical change also appears deeply unsettling as well. It is the subversion, if you like, of a naive sense of freedom, or a world devoid of the capacity for intervention. Think about what it would mean if we take the axiom of choice literally in a sense. If I'm the subject caught up in this forcing process, I produce a generic extension where nothing changes, or if I am actually engaged in a process, I'm trying to create a submodel in which no new event could ever occur or be acted on. I'm trying to destroy freedom. Well, that sounds incredibly American. It sounds like I'm trying to, undermine this capacity for intervention or something like that. I'm just going to finish this paragraph and I'll skip section 3, so I'll be like about 2 minutes and I'll be done. So the radical change can only occur in the symmetric submodel, and it's sort of unsettling. I think Badiou's philosophy doesn't provide any account of this kind of negative subject. I don't think it's covered by the sort of examples of evil in the ethics book, and nor do I think it's covered by the sort of obscure or reactive subjects in Logics of World. I think it's something distinctly kind of different. I'd be happy to hear otherwise, like I say. And I'd just like to sketch a couple of consequences and then I'll be done. So returning to the theme of existentialism that I began with, I would call this subject, provocatively, the authentic figure of bad faith, or perhaps more simply just a nihilist subject of some form. Okay? So this is a subject that is formally correct, okay? i.e. engaged in a generic procedure of forcing, a process indistinguishable from that of Badiou's faithful subject. There is no way from the formal activity of this subject that you could tell the difference if you were sort of participating in this change. There's no way that you would know or could tell that the world to come was going to have radical change in it or not. On the one hand, the subject could simply be deluded, expecting to find radical change in a generic extension, and this would be a sort of classic form of bad faith. They have abdicated their responsibility for their action by relying on the formal structure of a formal truth procedure to guarantee radical change, as we sort of talked about earlier, the good by Badiou's own definition. If they are unaware that their project lies in the formation, if they are aware that their project lies in the formation of the space between the extension of the ground model, they're actively seeking a space in which the power of intervention dies, freedom of choice is rendered impotent or destroyed. But what is interesting, and why I use the provocative sort of term first, is what is interesting is that this is a project of bad faith. To choose to be unfree, the classic sort of Sartrean sense, you cannot choose not to be free. But in this sense, you can. It's an authentic possibility. There is this perverse subject that has an authentic possibility to pursue its own unfreedom. So I also think, and this is the final paragraph, I also think that the way in which this perverse subject is indistinguishable from the activity of the faithful subject gives Badiou's philosophy an even stronger resonance with existentialism. This is the sense of existential risk that the individual experiences in their commitment to an event or an incorporation into a subject. The path that Badiou describes as being an event is already a difficult one. It's not easy to commit this sort of fidelity. The individual cannot hope for any rule to guide them in their commitment to an event highlighted by the non-constructible nature of generic sets. But the significance of Badiou's thought is to provide a formal systematic description of the lawless or illegal process. If we recognise that this process does not even guarantee radical change itself, it is in fact indistinguishable from a process that produces nothing new in the world to come. This reintroduces the full weight of angst, if you like, or anxiety and risk that is involved in our decision to intervene and act. In some ways, this takes us back to the theory of the subject between the pairs of anxiety and superego, and the courage and justice and the sort of notion of confidence that we find there. There is this, and this is the sort of final point, there is this sort of real sense of existential risk that's involved in just in being an event, in that existential project. Because even though Badiou gives us a great sort of formal structure for how change can occur, we can't sort of rely on that to be a guarantor of radical change. So even if I feel like I'm a Badiouian subject in some sort of revolutionary project, I have to take on the full existential responsibility of that action, because I might just be involved in nothing. So.
Yeah, small question. Not entirely sure how it fits, but you can tell me probably. And in the chapters on generic extension, there's a difference between the generic extension, which is infinite, and what Badiou calls an inquiry. And that's a finite operation of the militant subject of sorts. And in as much as your paper connects to kind of this existentialist and also individualist horizon, perhaps, that would be at the level of the inquiry, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I enjoyed when I first read Being the Best was it is a move beyond the philosophies of finitude and finding phenomenology, but at the same time it recognises something of that existential quality. And this is why I think you picked up on forcing procedure so much, because of the fact that these things that we say in terms of the inquiry, they can make a difference through a finite inquiry itself. Okay, so although you're engaging in an infinite project, your finite contribution, you are a finite mortal being, and your incorporation into an event will only last so long. But the point is that you can get results after a finite amount of time. There is relevance to the finite scale of human existence within the infinite project itself. It's not something like, if you like, the notion of the religious notion of the afterlife. There is an infinite reward after this life, but you have to kind of give up this finite life in order to get there. The way in which the forcing proofs are structured is you are incorporated in something that is infinite, but your finite contribution to that is capable of making a difference. And I think again that carries something of the existentialist resonance there, that ability to draw people in. So I know bad use philosophy obviously has an appeal to the traditional sort of radical left, but I also think it has this much broader kind of existentialist appeal, because it sort of speaks and says you can make a difference, and you can expect, well, not necessarily expect, but you can see a difference through your own finite action as well. You know, you don't have to sort of sacrifice yourself to some, thing that will only happen after everyone is dead and at some infinite point in the future. You can expect to contribute to radical change and expect your personal contribution to have some kind of effect on the outcome. So, yeah.
I see 3 hands. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, thank you very much for your paper. I just wanted to clarify before I ask my question. Are you talking about this in terms of your negative subject? Are you talking about cynicism or a cynical subject?
I don't know. I wanted to throw it out there because I've been thinking about this for years, and I think it's kind of like an interesting twist within the ontology there. So I have a lot of ideas about what I think that subject is, but in a sense I just wanted to present the idea so you guys can maybe come up with different alternative ideas. One of the avenues I went down was an obviously attractive one in terms of the genres, which was to call this subject, actually to call it the philosophical subject, controversially in some sort of respects, because it's precisely establishing, and a very traditional, if you like, theme of that subject is the questioning of freedom itself, and that's often being defined as the role of philosophy. Not always, not sort of exclusively, but there are many great philosophers in the tradition of philosophy for whom the question of freedom is the key philosophical question. And so this negative subject, in a sense, is actually perhaps challenging the presupposition or presupposed axiom of freedom, if you like, that is in all the other genres. And so it actually is questioning the validity of those genres itself, in a way, rather than acting as this sort of stewardship of the genres forming their compossibility. It's actually an active agent engaged in challenging those 4 genres, their separation, their compossibility. So that's one of the routes that I went down. But yeah, I think, I don't know, I think there's many different ways that you can interpret it, and it depends on lots of different things. I think one of the ways that you can look at it as well is it brings in elements of the unconscious. So the conscious aim of the subject is to produce the world to come, the generic extension. That's what they've affirmed and given themselves to. But really there's this sort of unconscious desire for unfreedom that's there. And so really there's this conscious projection of the world to come, which is going to be completely different and changed. But really there's a deep desire that nothing changes, and ultimately nothing should ever change, i.e. destroy the very idea of the possibility of intervention and something like that. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of things you can do with that idea.
Is still awaiting your question, or is it now covered?
I think we can talk about this later.
Okay, Andrew?
I'm going to follow straight on from it anyway. I prefer what you said, the perverse subject to the nihil. That's what you're really getting at, to the nihilist or cynical subject, the subject who chooses against their own interests, against the event, against the interests of the truth. And the place to look for that subject, I would submit, is the novels of Dostoevsky, where the question of freedom is also at stake all the time. And I think I think it's very intriguing, the question you've raised. I think it is not a category that Babi's thought covers, but I do think the way in which he thinks or gets inquiries does cover how, as it were, you find the perverse subject out. I think the difficulty with, I like reading Babi in relation to existentialism. I think it's a very fertile link, but it has certain limits. And I think part of the problem with it is that it tends to humanise questions that Babi formalises. And there's one particularly very, very effective description of what an inquiry means, which comes in the recently published Heidegger seminar. I think it's the 3rd seminar from the end, where he looks in a lot of formal detail at how you would discriminate between a subject of an event and a lapsed subject of an event, which we're, I think, covering all of the subject effectively, in terms of a stage-by-stage evaluation, which is exactly the word of coincidence and non-coincidence with the progress of truth? That wasn't a question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
No,
it was a response.
I would kind of defend
Yes,
it.
do respond.
I would sort of say that I don't think the lapsed subject covers it, because I think that this perverse subject is precisely fired by the same passion, by the same kind of like, it's not that they have thought there something happened and then given up on it, waiting for a possible resurrection in the future. I think it's precisely what's so interesting about it is the fact that it is formally, and obviously one of the great strengths and why we're all here for this particular workshop is the formalism that's involved in Baju's work. What's so sort of interesting about it is, from a certain formalist perspective, it's indistinguishable in terms of like the on-the-ground activity of what you would be doing as this sort of militant. You are creating the world to come, and one of the sort of things that I would want to think out more about it is what this means in terms of temporality and sort of history and things like this. What does it mean that, because the way that the sort of temporality works for the traditional subject in being an event is precisely there is this world to come, but I'm in relation to it. Like I said, the mathematician just does it. The mathematician says it has been completed. If we are living it, then we are projecting this world to come and at the same time trying to create it. We are caught in this bind. What the proof of the axiom of choice sort of says is that generic model has to be complete before the real thing can happen, which is a distillation, if you like, from that generic extension of this submodel. Like you can't get to that submodel without going to the generic extension first. It has to be made literally between the two. It can't be sort of like, oh, we'll forget the generic extension, we'll just make the submodel. I wish I understood formally why that was the case, but I've struggled enough just to sort of understand that much. But that's why I would say I don't think it's the lapse subject. I don't think it's any of the forms of disaster or anything like that, or the obscure subject or the reactive subject. Not least because those one of the typical responses is to sort of say, oh, there's all of these kind of disruptive generic sort of elements, and of course those elements are non-constructible only within the resources of the particular situation that we're dealing with. And one of the classic responses is to sort of say, well, actually, if we increase the power of the situation of the sort of set theoretical model, those non-constructible things become constructible when you introduce a higher level ordinal number, which kind of codes and structures the sort of situation. And that's one of the ways of destroying it. And that's one of the beauties of forcing, is it respects the non-constructibility and puts that non-constructible set to work. You can get rid of non-constructibility easily. And I think that's what's covered by some of the things like, I think that's the obscure subject where you want to apply it a bit anyway. So I really think it doesn't fall into any of these categories because it looks like, in every possible way, a faithful subject, and is formally, at least to a certain extent, is formally indistinguishable. I don't think it collapses. I'd be happy to
The term you want to
discuss
throw into the mix is indiscernibles.
Pardon?
The term you want to throw into the mix is indiscernibles. If it's formally indistinguishable, which Maddie makes a great deal.
Yeah.
Lots of lovely loose ends there to come back to, but another question.
My question will concern the first half of your presentation about the initial move you make interpreting the action of choice in terms of freedom and subjective freedom of that. Because I think that's an interesting idea, but I'm slightly puzzled by it. And the reason is that when you're doing mathematics, invoking the axiom of choice doesn't really feel like, throwing off the constraints in any way. On the contrary, its immediate ontological consequences are to impose an extraordinary restraint and stillness on the universe. If, for instance, you don't have the axiom of choice, you can't prove that all the quantities, all the cardinalities, lie in a line. You instead get this dense thicket of possible cardinalities and very little that you can say about it. It's like you're fighting your way through a jungle. So it seems to me that there is something, the effect the axiom of choice has on the mathematical universe is a slightly peculiar one, that isn't one of, it gets more creative or colourful or something like that. I mean, I also noticed that there's a subtle difference in the phrasing. I mean, you talk about, it says we have the freedom to choose, whereas a mathematician would typically say there is an arbitrary choice. And the emphasis is on arbitrariness rather than choice. That in a situation where we don't really have very much information about things, we're kind of thrown a life raft. And that seems to be, there's this distinction between we can choose and there is a choice, which seems to be, I think is kind of important here.
No,
and
I think
the trace of intervention rather than the intervention itself.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the ways in which Baudu's philosophy is precisely a move beyond. It's not simply trying to resurrect the phenomenological subject of existentialism, precisely because that freedom of choice, it no longer looks like an imaginative, whimsical choice. It becomes an affirmation of contingency and chance. And so I totally agree with you. I just kind of put it out there kind of provocatively to begin with, for sure. And I think that really is catched out in the first point that you make, that again I kind of agree with, which is that the axiom of choice is, if it is this sort of reworking of the concept of freedom, it's not something that we just wholeheartedly praise and worship and think is brilliant. And it's also not, as you sort of say, this sort of sense of a radical kind of like exhilarating freedom. It's precisely, as you say, and as Baudu sort of states, it's a tyrannical power. When it's exercised, if you like, in the traditional existentialist mode, like all I need to do is recognise my freedom and exercise it. That results, as you say, in the most kind of like awesome restrictions and the most perfect imposition of order. If it is exercised like that, and that's why if we are a subject with this capacity, and as you sort of say, Ian, we are rational beings. That means we can use mathematics, i.e., we have this capacity for intervention. We're not automata who just do constructive processes or programs. We have this kind of capacity, and that's sort of encoded in the axiom of choice, because that's what really opens up set theory to be so sort of creative. But it's not simply the exercise of that. That's not this sort of existentialist rush of power. Well, it is precisely a rush of power. It gives you this almost godlike power to be, just exercise this kind of rigid order on everything. Whereas it's at its most interesting precisely when it's in concert with an event or the trace of the event in terms of non-constructibility. And I think that's what's really interesting about the forcing proofs and those sort of things. It's precisely, respecting the non-constructibility. The axiom of choice is necessary to respect the contingency and to affirm it as contingency. And I think that's the fundamental transformation in that move from existentialist freedom to this sort of notion of freedom. And it's found in all sorts of contemporary philosophers as well, this affirmation of contingency, the allegory of chance in some sort of sense. But it still gives you the same kind of brain freeze as well. What does it mean to make arbitrary free choices? What does it mean for something to be genuinely random? And again, that's what gives people a distaste for the axiom of choice. Surely, any random pattern of numbers, there must be an underlying rule, there must be an underlying process. But the axiom of choice obviously affirms that there are certain times where something is completely random. So, no, I totally, pretty much disagree with that.
Here's a question, then we'll break for lunch.
I think we have some means to give an answer to your question. First of all, in my work, we have a definition of freedom. So, for me, freedom is not at all a pre-existent concept. Freedom is defined inside my work. And so, ontologically, first, what is freedom for a subject is to be active point of the construction of a generic set. So we can define if we define freedom outside this context, we define freedom in a complete separation with truth. Or maybe my fundamental idea is to say that there is no subjectivity in a real sense which is separated of a truth procedure. So, and there is in some sense no subject. So, for example, I don't think that there is something like freedom of individuals individuals are part of the social games with this law and so on. So ontologically, it's clear that the subject and freedom of the subject is to be a part of the construction of a generic set. And the question of genericity is fundamental. So there is no freedom outside some form of universality, because the generic set is precisely the ontological definition of something which is universal. And at the level of phenomenology, anthropology, that is the level of the logic of the world, it's something different. In some sense, to be free is to be the part of the subjectival body. So it's not a question of generic set, it's a question of subjectival body. And I accept to say that the relationship between the two is obscure. It's obscure, and it's why I am the necessity to write a third book. To create the clarification of the very difficult question of the relationship between the ontological level where truth and subjective freedom are defined in the context of generic sets, and the other anthropological, in some sense, definition where freedom is defined than the incorporation to subjectual body. And I think that every true subjectivation, that is, every form of active freedom, creates the fiction of lateral freedom, which is by opposition of the true freedom. And so I think we must divide freedom. That is my proposition. Naturally, for me, it's true freedom on one side, false freedom on the other side. But don't conclude immediately, but only the division. And in some sense, it's the question of the novelty in a world of reactive and obscure subjectivity. Because I don't negate that there is some form of freedom in a reactive subject and in obscure subject. But it's the division of the very definition of freedom between its universal part, so freedom in correlation, relationship with equality and universality, and a sort of counter-freedom, of freedom of an other form, which is the freedom of reactivity against, in some sense, universality, and also freedom of pure negation of universality. And in fact, we can find here some paradigmatic freedom in history, freedom of pure rebellion, nihilistic freedom, freedom of pure individuality, and so on and so on. And so something like that exists. But finally, my proper determination is to say that freedom properly is ontologically to be a part of the construction of generic set, and anthropologically to be a part of subjectival body, which is the materiality of the becoming of its good. So I accept to say that the question of freedom is not completely clear, because precisely we can divide the concept of freedom, it's a possibility, and so it's a question of extension of the concept, in some sense, of freedom. And maybe I propose a restrict concept of freedom, which is for me my elasticity in relationship with universality and genericity and subjectual body. But I accept that it's not a complete exhaustion of Mosaic concept of freedom. But we return, in this case, if we adopt this concept, this second concept of freedom, we return, in my sense, from the subject to the individual, in some sense, even if this individual is in relationship, in dialectical relationship to the subject, because reactive subject is a subject in some sense, and maybe a free subject. But a free subject, the very essence of the free subject in the form of active subject, finally is a faithful subject. Because it's the negation reactive of the faithful subject, or the desire to destroy the faithful subject, are something like free proposition, a free proposition which are their very essence not inside themselves, but outside, in the faithful subject. And it is why, at the hand, even the freedom of the reactive subject and of the obscure subject is in dependency of the pure subject, of the faithful subject.
Yeah, thank you very much. Giving me a real refinement to what I'm trying to say.
It's a very complex discussion. I have to say that. It's a very complex discussion.
No, I like very much the sort of sense that you give to freedom is never something that is in potential. It only exists in the activity of the production of the truth. So when I talk about freedom in my paper, I talk about it in that sort of sense of a potential. Like every individual has the potential to be involved in a truth procedure, and that's sort of encoded in the axiom of choice. What you're sort of saying is that potential cannot be called freedom. It's a potential to become free, to be incorporated, but it's only freedom at the point that it is making a material difference in the world, whether positively or reactively or excluded. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Oliver, Brian, and everyone for that very good session.